YouTube, welcome back to my channel. Today I'm going to share the books that I read in February. You'll notice that some books that I mentioned in February are not going to be discussed here because I didn't finish them, but this list includes the 13 books that I read and completed in February. And after I give you a little synopsis of each book and maybe talk about what I liked about it, then we're going to do another installment of Booklinks, where I try to link each book with the book I read before and after it to see what kind of natural segues exist between books that I read in the order that I read them. So the first book that I read in February was Alice Walker's The Color Purple. This one is about two sisters who are teenagers when we meet them, Celie and Nettie. Celie is said to be an unattractive girl, and her sister, who's being courted by this older man, her father, who's being very abusive to both of them, decides that he'll marry off Celie to this man who just really wants a housewife. And so Celie's life moves from one abusive situation to the other, and because she doesn't have any other way to express herself, she starts writing letters to God. When things happen and she loses contact with her sister, she stops believing in God and starts writing letters to her sister instead. And this book is the experience that both sisters have. One living a racially charged and abusive life in the south of the United States, and the other sister working as a missionary and going to Africa. So these letters reveal what is going on in the world through the perspective of these two women. Then I read The Bluest Eye by Toni Morrison. This is also about two sisters named Claudia and Frida, and another young girl comes to live with them for some time. Pecola Breedlove is her name, and she's there because her family has had some downturn in their financial situation, but also because her father has been abusing her. And Pecola sees how life is very different for girls who are pretty, girls who are blonde, girls who have blue eyes. And so Pecola's greatest desire is also to have blue eyes, because she thinks a change in her physical appearance will also change a life that she's experiencing. Then I read The Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass, an American slave, written by himself. This, of course, is Frederick Douglass's memoir. He was born into enslavement on a plantation in Maryland, and he escaped slavery when he was just, I think, 28 years old. And so this is his recollection of events that happened while he was a slave, but also how he became a free man, talking about how his master's wife taught him how to read and write, and how later he was able to also teach others to read and write and help change their circumstances as they moved out of slavery. Then I read Family Tree by Susan Wiggs. I got this one from the publisher in order to do a review. It's about this young woman named Annie who seems to have the perfect life when we meet her. She works with her husband. They have a husband and wife production team. Her husband is a chef, and she's a producer of their TV cooking show. And on the day we meet her, she finds out she's pregnant. She's on her way to tell her husband the good news, and there's an accident. She gets into a coma. When she wakes up, a year has gone by. Her husband has divorced her and also shipped her back home to her family maple farm in Vermont. The rest of the story takes place on this maple farm, and through it we learn a lot about maple production, maybe more than you ever wanted to know. This is a story about family, but also about returning to your first love, whatever that thing is, whether it was a person, whether it was a family, or the place that you grew up, or the thing, the passion that you always had but had kind of forgotten over time. Then I read Best Day Ever by Kara Ruda. This is a thriller narrated by a husband, Paul Strom, who has orchestrated this weekend getaway for his wife, Mia. And while they're in the car, he's telling us about his past, about things that he's done, and we slowly realize that he's a psychopath, and the things that he's telling us is no one's idea of the best day ever. But it is a thriller, so we gradually learn that things aren't exactly what he says they are or what his wife says things are either. Then I read The Drive by Jane Harper. This is set in Australia, and it's about the investigation of what seems like a murder-suicide. A man, his wife, and their child have been killed, and it seems like the man killed his family. But his friend, who has come back to attend the funeral, starts to investigate these murders as well as the death of one of their friends who had died as a teenager, and starts to figure out what really happened. Then I read The Humans by Matt Haig. This was a little otherworldly and supernatural because it's about an alien from another planet who comes to Earth to take over the body of a professor named Andrew Martin, who solved the Riemann hypothesis. But the aliens can't allow for anyone to know about how to solve this problem. So they've taken over Andrew Martin's body and they want to kill everyone who he's told about the solution. But when he comes to Earth and starts having relationships with other humans, this alien goes rogue and starts to veer from the original plan. So it's a book about unlikely relationships and the power that relationships have over us. Then I read Dust Tracks on a Road by Zora Neale Hurston. This was her autobiography, and it starts off with her describing the town where she grew up, which she says is the first town in the United States to be ruled completely by African Americans. In this book, she tells us about her life going to Howard University, as well as moving to Harlem and the relationships that she develops with other popular writers during the Harlem Renaissance period. Then I read a short story collection by Nick Joaquin called The Woman Who Had Two Navels and Tales of the Tropical Gothic. This one was set in Manila in the Philippines, and most of the stories take place during that post-colonial period, and so they have some amount of religious influence, but also some of the angst that the people who were living in that time were experiencing. Then I read Rise and Grind by Damon John and his co-writer Daniel Paisner. In this one, Damon John talks about his own rise as an entrepreneur, but he also interviews several people from different aspects of the industry and shares their tips on how to rise and grind, how to conceive of the ideas to become an entrepreneur, and also some of the habits that you need to develop and cultivate in order to continue to be successful. In this one, he interviewed people like Catherine Zeta-Jones, who's a famous actress but also has her own lifestyle brand. He interviewed Gary Vaynerchuk, Kyle Maynard, and Nellie Galan from Telemundo, among others. So this one was a business self-help book, but also a very interesting memoir. So I don't usually read these books in their entirety, but this one I read almost completely in a couple of days, so this is one that I also recommend. Then I read another book from the publisher. I got Fatal Chaos by Marie Force. This is a book in a series called the Fatal series, and it's kind of a romance novel, Harlequin romance, but there's also a crime mystery component. In this one, the main characters are Samantha and Nick. Sam is a police officer in the Washington, D.C. area. Her husband is the Vice President of the United States. And Sam is investigating a series of murders. A sniper has been shooting and killing people from a moving car, and she's in charge of the investigation, trying to find out who's behind this and how they can stop them before the bodies pile up. Then I read or reread The Sellout by Paul Beatty. I read this one for the Runwright Reads Book Club. This one is about an unnamed narrator who, in his misguided attempt to bring back the name and the popularity of his town of Dickens, California, brings back segregation and slavery. So when we meet him, he's in the middle of a Supreme Court case because he has been charged with undoing 140 years of history. This, of course, is a satirical look at some of the racial issues in this country. Paul Beatty's writing in this one can best be described as masterful wordplay, but the language is very racially charged, very offensive, very derogatory in many places. And so this is a book that a lot of people I know have had difficulty reading. For me, it was also a very controversial read. It deals with a very serious topic, but it's overlaid with very offensive comedy. So read this one at your own risk. Finally, I read I Am Not Your Negro by James Baldwin. This one, I think, is the show notes for the movie that was released last year, and it is compiled from letters that James Baldwin wrote or were written to him during his life. And in this one, he reacts to a lot of racial issues that have happened. He reacts to the murders of his three friends, Medgar Evers, Malcolm X, and Martin Luther King Jr., as well as he offers commentary on several other issues and episodes in Black history. So those are the 13 books that I read in February. Now to see how they link. This one is easy. Both of these books have a girl who's being sexually abused and who bears a child from that incestual situation. These two books have a child who's being raised by someone who's not their parent. In this one is Pecola Breedlove, who goes to stay with Claudia and Frida's parents when her father throws her out of the house. And this one is about Frederick Douglass, who isn't raised by his mother. Of course, he doesn't know his father. The rumor is that his father is his white slave owner, but he's not allowed to be raised by his mom, and his mom only gets to come to see him sometimes at night, and only when she steals away in order to do so. The unlikely segue between these two books is that both of these main characters are born on farms. Frederick Douglass, of course, born on a slave plantation, and Annie in this one born on a maple farm in Vermont. These two books feature couples who work together. In this one, Annie and her husband have a husband and wife cooking show on TV, and in this one, Paul and Mia meet when they both work at an ad agency. Both of these books are thrillers that feature a family murder situation. In this one, we have a man who may or may not have killed his parents. In this one, we have a man who may or may not have killed his wife and child. This one is about a man who leaves town but comes back to solve a murder. This one is about an alien who leaves his town or his planet to come to Earth to murder a man. In this one, the inhabitants of the planet are all immortal. And in this one, there's a character named Mateo who is seeking immortality. Spoiler alert, it doesn't work out. Both of these books talk about examining the past to figure out the future. There's a story in this one about the god Janus who has two faces, one looking backwards and one looking forwards. And in this one, of course, Zora Neale Hurston talks about the foundations of the town where she was born and how that impacts her life moving forward. Both of these books talk about the sacrifice that a mother makes, and this successful person credits their mother as being the reason for their success. In this one, Zora Neale Hurston talks about how in choosing to marry her husband, her mother was disowned by her own parents. Her mother refused to talk to her. And in this one, Damon John talks about how his mother mortgaged the family home in order to have enough money to stay home to keep him out of trouble during a particularly difficult time in his childhood. And both of these books feature an African-American man and the relationship that he has with his friends when he's trying to make it and even after he's made it. In this one, of course, Damon John and his friends work to start the FUBU brand. And in this one, the unnamed narrator talks about how his friend Hominy latches onto him and decides to become his slave after he's become successful. Both of these books have a Washington, D.C. setting. In this one, the prologue opens up on the unnamed character being on the steps of the Supreme Court. In this one, the female main character is a member of the Washington, D.C. Metro Police Force. Also, these two books are about murders. This one, of course, Samantha is investigating the murders, and in this one, James Baldwin reflects on his three friends being murdered. And finally, to link these two books, these both talk about letters. This, of course, is compiled from letters that James Baldwin wrote and letters that were written to him. This one is epistolary fiction. This story is told through a series of letters. First, the letters that Steely writes to God, and the letters that she and Nettie exchange with each other. And that's it. Those are book links. Those are the 13 books that I read in February, and that's how they all link with each other. Leave me a comment down below if you've read any of these books and you want to talk about them. And if you're enjoying this book links series that I'm doing, go ahead and tell me about it in the comments. So we'll talk down there. And until next time, happy reading. Bye.